strata of society.
There were many gradations in the system, from the king to the top feudal nobility, the dukes and counts, to the lesser feudal nobility, knights, squires, peasants, and so forth. The biggest distinction was between the aristocracy and the peasantry.
Nobility was originally the warrior class, or warrior category, the warrior grouping in society. There were people whose major preoccupation was violence, war, conquest. Therefore, in most countries, nobilities, as a distinctive feature, had the right, and usually monopolistic right, to bear arms. If you had a sword, it was a signal that you belong to this particular stratum of nobility, which was a highly privileged stratum, itself stratified. There were poor noblemen and rich noblemen, but it didn't matter. The property, the wealth did not stratify people. What did stratify was birth and the specific rights.
Medieval society was split into three groups. First came the nobility, then the clergy, and below them everyone else, in a group called the Third Estate. Originally, the Third Estate was almost exclusively made up of peasants. But as cities became more prosperous, more and more craftsmen and small merchants joined them.
The transition to modern capitalism was largely a matter of this bourgeoisie growing larger and more powerful, developing bigger property, and developing more and more trade that linked the bourgeois of one city to the bourgeois of another city and created something of a European-wide and eventually a global commercial class.
The bourgeoisie prospered on the fringes of the feudal system. But as its economic power increased, a real class struggle began between the bourgeoisie and the nobility. The greatest thinkers of the time belonged to the bourgeoisie. It was Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, and their like who laid the ideological foundations of the French Revolution.
The French Revolution was, for Karl Marx, a bourgeois revolution because the people who were most important in making it were members of the urban bourgeoisie who were unhappy with the way in which they were denied political rights by the feudal aristocracy. They sought to have political rights that were equal to their economic importance. They were independent businessmen in a small way in their crafts or their occupations, and they pursued the extension of their independence into the decision-making of the state. Peasants and workers did participate in the French Revolution, but they were not the people who were conceptualizing it and who were taking control of it.
The concept of human rights appeared with the French Revolution. Justice, fraternity, and equality became the major principles on which all social relationships were based, be the person a noble or a commoner. In real terms, the lives of laborers and peasants were not improved. It was the bourgeoisie whose lives profited from the nobles' losses and who gained entry into the country's political and juridical life. In fact, the split widened between the poorer classes and the rich bourgeoisie, whose lifestyles began to resemble the lifestyles of the nobility more and more. Marriages between nobles and bourgeois, which were unthinkable before, became commonplace. From that point on, it was not birth that guaranteed a position in the social order, but the power of money. During the 19th century, hordes of peasants abandoned the countryside to work in the city. The Industrial Revolution brought with it an unprecedented transformation in the social order.
More and more people became landless laborers who worked simply for a wage in rural society. And those people suffered a decline in their standard of living compared to the peasants, and they were no longer taken care of by the feudal elites. That's one reason why they were willing to move into the cities to become industrial workers. The idea of class as such grew primarily in reflection of the growth of cities and the concentration of large numbers of people in working class positions within the cities, which opened the idea of a society structured by class relations rather than by the older feudal system.
Early in the 19th century, industry began to hire labor indiscriminately. Unqualified men, women, and children worked in appalling conditions for as much as 16 hours a day, for a pittance that barely allowed them to survive.
People believed that there was nevertheless a class, the working class. First, they were the ones who produced the real wealth. The machines and the railroads, they built the buildings. They were really the ones at the root of this wealth. It was probably the first class that had an awareness of class, that had an historical part to play as a class.
As workers became aware of their position, they began to form movements to promote their rights. In 1847, textile workers in Great Britain managed to have their working day reduced to 10 hours. These labor revolts caught the attention of many intellectuals. The most famous of these, whose ideas were to influence all of political life in the 20th century, was Karl Marx. This German philosopher advocated a radical change in society. With his colleague Friedrich Engels, he wrote the Communist Manifesto.
The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the struggling classes.
Karl Marx developed probably the most compelling and most famous principles, theoretical views of class. First, he argued that social classes gradually transform themselves from abstract categories to real politically organized communities. Secondly, he argued that this process is inevitable because of exploitation of the working class through the process of commodity production by bourgeoisie. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, that this conflict will lead, according to Marx, inevitably to the collapse of capitalism and a new type of society in which classes will disappear because their basis, private property, will be in some way socialized, nationalized, or redistributed through society.
Marxist thought bred many workers' movements in England, Germany, and France. In 1864, various workers' parties, striving to start a proletarian revolution, united to form the International Working Men's Association, with Karl Marx as its leader. Marx believed that the socialist revolution would occur in a highly industrialized country. But no, the first communist regime established itself in pre-industrial Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. Governed by Tsar Nicholas II, the country had fallen prey to massive economic disorganization and a serious famine. The gap between rich and poor was huge.
It was a great disappointment to the Bolshevik leaders and the observers in the West that the Russian Revolution did not achieve what Marx hoped for, did not achieve egalitarian societies. In spite of the claims of the Bolsheviks, the state takeover of private property resulted in the creation of a very powerful and pervasive bureaucratic hierarchy. The top ranks of the Soviet societies